There's nothing like crawling into bed on a chilly night and knowing your warm blanket awaits you. Once you're in, you probably want to stay forever. But one woman in the UK has taken that relationship further than just a cozy night of sleep. She plans to marry her blanket. Yep, you heard me right. On February 10th, 49-year-old Pascal Selleck will marry her blanket, and she's even enlisted a wedding planner to help with the big day. She said, quote, "My duvet is the longest, strongest, most intimate and reliable relationship that I've ever had. That's because it has always been there for me and gives me great hugs." If you're curious, don't worry. Selleck said she wants the public to witness the ceremony. Like any other wedding, the party will reportedly have a wedding band, speeches, and a cake. The bride will reportedly wear fluffy slippers and a nightgown, and the guests are encouraged to dress just as comfortably. At least she won't have to worry about cold feet.
According to CNN, for weeks, temperatures in Australia have continued to rise, with all 8 of the country's states and territories affected by sweltering temperatures. Throughout the country, roads have melted, infrastructure has failed, and masses of animals and fish have died as a result of the heat. The southern city of Adelaide experienced its hottest day on record on January 24th, reaching 116 degrees Fahrenheit. Australia's Bureau of Meteorology announced it has been the country's hottest January on record and has described the weather as unprecedented.
Minneapolis, which is among the coldest places in the country right now. The actual temperature without the wind chill could get as low as -30 degrees. Let's take a look at these Minneapolis firefighters showing just how cold it is. You can see what happens when they remove their helmets. The steam just rising right off of them. And ABC's Eva Pilgrim, she is there in Chicago. We know you have lots of layers on, Eva, but for many people, it's really not safe to be outside in these conditions.
Well, that's why we're starting this off inside, because it is dangerously cold outside. You can get frostbite in just a matter of mere minutes in these temperatures. Okay, we're going to take a deep breath, and we are heading outside so we can show you just how cold it is out there. And as you get out here, I've got some hot water. I'm just going to throw it in the air. You can see it very quickly turns into ice and snow. These temperatures, anything that's a liquid on your face, in your eyes, your tear ducts, they freeze. Inside your nose, they freeze. The liquid in your mouth starts to seize up. You just sort of like get very, very hard to discuss or talk anything, as you can tell. This is an egg. We stuck it out here about an hour or 2 hours ago. It is rock solid at this point. You can just hear it pop, and Brian, our producer, has this hammer. I just want to kind of reiterate that idea. There it goes. It finally cracks open. It is basically an ice cube. And Brian, come here. I just want to show you. This is what everyone else looks like out here right now. Faces completely covered, the goggles on, because your eyes water, and then that water turns into ice. I had icicles in my tear ducts yesterday,
Even before
guys.
the road begins the slow wind through Yongala National Park in Queensland, the signs are visible. Pockets of the landscape left charred and scarred by one of 130 bushfires that raced across the state late last year.
2.5 kilometres in 15 minutes. This come from this side of the valley, right across the valley.
Tess Ford had a front row view from the edge of her pub's perch
So the fireball is pretty much right there.
of a fire that tore through the valley below.
The Thursday morning was the morning that I got up, and there was a massive fireball out the front here.
What makes this particular fire stand out is that it took place in a rainforest, once thought to be the kind of environment with a natural protection against such events.
At 4 to 5 a.m. in the morning, fire raced up the hill and crowned through the rainforest, something that I've not seen before in my career. So I've been doing this 32 years.
The only real defense a rainforest has from any outside threat is its perimeter. Once that perimeter is compromised or damaged in any way, as we saw here a couple of months ago, there's nothing stopping that threat from racing through. Other extreme weather events played a role in fueling the devastating fires.
We'd had the damage from Cyclone Debbie in 17. It had shredded the canopy of the rainforest, allowing more light, more drying, and obviously put a lot more fuel on the ground.
And periods of hot, dry weather created the perfect invitation.
What we're seeing in the last few decades, of course, is that projections of climate change are increasingly becoming observations of climate change.
The United Nations says natural disasters affected more than 60 million people around the world in 2018. claiming more than 10,000 lives.
Absolutely.
University of Macquarie biology professor Leslie Hughes studies the impacts from climate change. She says weather extremes are becoming more intense and more frequent, in some cases faster than we can adapt to handle them.
Seeing a whole town in California wiped out and several towns in Victoria wiped out in 2009, that's not something you can adapt to very easily. You know, a lot of people lose their lives. Once they're gone, they're gone. Whole communities are destroyed. You know, those are not things that you can adapt to.
In Australia, the bushfire season is becoming longer, giving emergency workers less time to deal with other weather events.
It becomes quite harder on the volunteer to actually have that recovery point, because traditionally fires in September, finish October, November, first big storms, wait for Christmas and everyone has a break, whereas that doesn't happen as much these days.
See where this is green grass?
Tess Ford is worried about the lasting impact to the landscape around her.
We will be watching really carefully what the environmental impact is, because part of the forest is not going to come back quickly.
Scientists agree, saying it could take hundreds of years for the rainforest here to fully recover. Greg Navarro, CGTN, Yongala.
That dangerous cold blast still bearing down on the Midwest, now settling into the East Coast this morning.
Let's take a look at Wisconsin right now. Look at those temperatures right there, minus 16 degrees. So many people waking up to so much cold. Upstate New York, lake effect snow is coming down. You see it right there. They could get more than a foot on top of what they already have.
And that deep chill is moving in fast. Let's take a look at this time-lapse video showing a snow squall sweeping through New York City in an instant, bringing whiteout conditions and bitter air came behind that.
You know what? That was right outside of my window, my apartment window. I saw that when it happened.
Yeah, and I was having lunch, and my back was to the door, and I turned around. I'm like, where did that come from? Yeah, out of nowhere.
That's it. So here is what we know right now. The cold has caused at least 8 deaths, and this morning 29 states are under cold and snow alerts. We have team coverage. Ginger is back. She's starting us off here in Times Square with the latest. Good morning, Ginger.
The question is, why did I come back? It feels about 100 degrees colder here than I was about 12 hours ago, and so many of you have been dealing with this for at least 3, if not 5 days. So let's talk about it. This morning we bottomed out at 2 here. That is the coldest since the winter of 2016. It feels like 17 below, and folks in Duluth, Minnesota are actually seeing schools closed because of the cold. Look how cold it got. 55 below wind chills in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Chicago, 52 below the feels like. Those are the coldest wind chills y'all have seen since 1985. So it's seriously once in a generation here. So how cold is it this morning? Well, Detroit feels like 33 below. It feels like 1 below in Cincinnati, and Philadelphia feels like 8
Wear thick
below.
jackets, drink plenty of fluids, and eat fruits and vegetables. Those are a few reminders of health authorities in the Philippines as locals in northern towns deal with cold temperatures hitting 9 degrees Celsius or 48 Fahrenheit. The Department of Health said Wednesday, January 30th, residents in Baguio City should take extra precaution to avoid spreading cold and flu viruses. Temperatures in some of the upland areas of Benguet have meanwhile dropped to 6.2 degrees, while a 4 degrees Celsius hit the municipality of Atok. The phenomenon has also affected the livelihood of some farmers as frost blankets vegetable crops. The frost reportedly will not cause any major consequences. Many farm workers have learned to cope with the freezing temperatures. According to the country's State Weather Bureau, temperatures of 46 Fahrenheit are expected to hit Baguio as the temperature continues to drop over the next month.
Hold our standards. The INF Treaty is an example. You heard from colleagues today in unison on who is in violation of that treaty. We maintain open to dialogue. The door is open. We'll have a meeting again today. So the United States has not closed the door on that, but again, we're here to uphold the standards of arms control regimes.
The INF Treaty between the U.S. and former Soviet Union was signed in 1987. It bans land-based cruise and ballistic missiles with a range of 500 to 5,500 kilometers. The U.S. has been accusing Russia of violating the treaty, and in October, U.S. President Donald Trump announced his plans to pull out. Russia has repeatedly denied any wrongdoing and accused the United States of refusing to negotiate.
The meeting, which we had yesterday as a Conference of Five, took place at a time when bilateral dialogue is difficult on some issues, when one of the parties won't engage in this dialogue. As far as Russia is concerned, we're not to blame for anything. We're open for talks on all issues, even the most acute problems, and we're willing to be as open.
Bangkok officials have ordered over 400 schools to close temporarily as the city chokes with toxic levels of air pollution. The Education Ministry on Wednesday, January 30th, announced the two-day closure of 437 private and public schools and vocational education centers. Bangkok has been dealing with persisting smog and on Monday recorded the heavy presence of the dangerous ultrafine dust called PM 2.5. Many residents wear face masks and refrain from going outside in fear of the toxic air. The local government has also imposed measures to curb the situation. 50 drones will be deployed in the next days to sprinkle water to worst-hit areas. Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha meanwhile ordered soldiers to inspect factories in the provinces to see whether their emissions are in permissible levels. An official said more stringent measures will be rolled out next
Hundreds
week.
of Palestinian protesters took to the naval border fence in northern Gaza near Zikim Beach on Tuesday to participate in a protest organized by the International Committee for Breaking the Siege on Gaza. Palestinian protesters threw stones, burned tires, and flew flaming kites. Meanwhile, Israeli troops fired tear gas and rubber bullets in order to disperse the demonstrators.
Even though I, my wife, and son were previously injured in the Great Return March protest, I am committed to come to every protest in order to express my anger and ask for our rights to be granted.
Among the injured, the Palestinian Health Ministry says several protesters were hit by live bullets. Others suffered from inhalation of tear gas. Meanwhile, around 10 Palestinian boats sailed off the coast to challenge the maritime blockade over the Strip.
As long as there's an Israeli occupation and Israeli blockade on Gaza, our protests will continue. We are simply asking for our freedom, and Israel has occupied our land, air, and our sea.
Many attempts have been made throughout the years to draw the public's attention to the ongoing siege of the Gaza Strip, whether via ships attempting to sail into or out of Gaza.
Palestinian maritime protests have been suspended for weeks under a truce agreement between Israel and Hamas. However, Palestinians in Gaza have started demonstrating again as Israel's siege on the coastal enclave becomes increasingly more restrictive. Nur Harazin, CGTN.
Demonstrators in New Delhi. Former Indian Army officials gathered to express their mounting frustration ahead of elections in the coming months.
Army men are very angry with the government because they have not fulfilled the promise which they made. Whereas the soldier, whenever he makes a promise, even if he has to sacrifice his life, he is ready to do that without thinking what will happen to his family, what will happen to his children and everyone.
That unfulfilled promise is a scheme known as One Rank, One Pension. The program was supposed to provide an equal amount of pension pay to defense personnel retiring in the same rank and with the same length of service, regardless of their date of retirement. Over 2 million ex-servicemen and hundreds of thousands of war widows stand to be the immediate beneficiaries.
We are not asking for doles, we are not asking for beef. It is our right, which they should not have denied us for all these years.
This gathering marks the beginning of 9 days of planned protests near Parliament to highlight what participants say is the worsening socio-economic conditions under the government of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who came to power in 2014. At the time, one of the main promises he made was to implement the Equal Pension Plan. Demonstrators say it still hasn't happened.
Modi had promised the army men one rank, one pension in his 2013 election rally if they supported him in the 2014 elections. The army men fulfilled their promise and supported Modi and helped him become the PM, but he has forgotten his promise.
Government officials say they've begun implementing the policy, but these demonstrators say that's not the case. Now, in the run-up to this year's general election, many will continue to ask when or if this long-standing demand of the Indian Armed Forces and veterans will be met. Mohammed Jamjoom, Al Jazeera.
But American leadership is absolutely essential.
This doesn't usually happen. The Republican leader of the Senate introducing an amendment urging the president, a member of his own party, to change his policy and not change the level of U.S. troops in Syria or Afghanistan.
So what we must remember, Mr. President, is how hard-won these gains have been. Our response to this progress must not be to take our foot off the gas pedal, but rather to keep up those strategies that are clearly working.
This followed another highly unusual move, the president's own intelligence chiefs telling Congress Tuesday that their boss, the President of the United States, is wrong a lot. On North Korea not going to give up nuclear weapons, on Iran not actually violating its nuclear agreement, on ISIL.
ISIS will continue to be a threat.
Not really defeated, and the southern border not mentioned, not a crisis. The president was not happy, and he took to Twitter to call his own officials extremely passive and naive, and in another tweet suggested perhaps intelligence should go back to school.
The President of the United States!
For 2 years, this is a president who has mostly gone unchallenged by his cabinet, by his party in Congress. But that seems to be changing now. Patty Culhane, Al Jazeera, Washington.
It was on the sidelines of the European Union foreign ministers meeting in Bucharest that France, Britain and Germany launched a new EU payment mechanism to allow European companies to continue trading with Iran and bypass US sanctions. Ministers hope the initiative will safeguard the 2015 Iran nuclear deal and help ensure regional stability.
We are making clear that we are not only talking about keeping the nuclear agreement alive, but we are now creating a possibility to do business transactions. That is a prerequisite for us, so we can deliver on our obligations and in return be able to ask Iran not to develop enriched uranium for military use.
The EU's foreign policy chief, who was one of the 2015 deal's main negotiators, welcomed the trade system called INSTEX.
The establishment of the special purpose vehicle is, I believe, the mechanism that will allow for legitimate trade to Iran to continue as foreseen in the nuclear agreement. So full support from our side.
The EU payment system will avoid transfers in dollars. It will be based in Paris, overseen by a banking manager in Germany and supervised by a board in the United Kingdom. In the beginning, it will be for trade and things like medicine, food and some humanitarian items. But the idea is that it could be expanded to trade in other areas. The mechanism will help mainly small and medium businesses, but it may not be enough to persuade European multinationals, such as French oil giant Total or German car maker Daimler, to resume trade with Iran and risk US penalties. But some analysts say its symbolism is important because it sends two clear messages. One to Tehran that the EU is serious about maintaining the nuclear deal, and the other to Washington.
Washington is a message it sends about the future as well. Here, the Europeans, I think, are signaling that if the US continues this overuse and overreach of its secondary sanctions policy, that the Europeans can really begin to build up something bigger in response to it, and that this special purpose vehicle is just the first step.
Donald Trump says he hopes that US sanctions will force Tehran into a new deal. So far, Iranian leaders say they won't renegotiate, but they welcome the EU payment plan. Those here will hope that the mechanism will save the nuclear agreement, because if it collapses, it could deal a blow to Europe's efforts and credibility. Natasha Butler, Al Jazeera, Paris.
Government supporters marched through Bangui, hoping to pressure diplomats in New York. Central African Republic is under an international embargo to stop it from buying arms and ammunition for its military and police.
I am angry for my country. We want the immediate lift of the arms embargo to give power to our armed forces, to start working on bringing peace to our country.
Imposed by the UN 5 years ago after a coup that led to months of violence, it was meant to bring stability to a country that's seen years of fighting. Now the government says it needs the weapons to fight rebels who control nearly 80% of the nation.
How can we say that the embargo is a good thing for our country while our national army doesn't have weapons and the rebels are arming themselves every day?
There is a lock that needs to be opened. What is that lock? It's the one that's impacting our security forces.
But the UN isn't convinced that more guns are a good idea. Russia received an exemption to the embargo and provided light arms to government forces and sent military trainers last year. A UN panel found that Russia's intervention created an arms race with the rebels, pushing them to increase their own stockpiles. There are also peace talks. Rebel leaders met government representatives last week in Sudan. There's a lot to discuss. 14 different rebel groups fighting each other, pitting Muslim and Christian communities against each other to control a country rich in minerals, diamonds and gold. The Norwegian Refugee Council has warned of a catastrophe if the talks fail. For now, a UN peacekeeping force of nearly 15,000 is on the ground, but the government wants to take charge and says it needs guns to do that. Charlotte Ballas, Al Jazeera.
It's almost Valentine's Day, and for singles, this day can be a little annoying. But instead of sitting on your couch alone, watching sad movies, stuffing your face with chocolates, and complaining about Steve or Cindy that broke your heart, do something creative, like name a cockroach after them. That's right, at the Hemsley Conservation Centre in England, you can pay about $2 to name one of those pesky little bugs after the ex, someone not so special, in their Name a Cockroach program. According to its website, the proceeds will go to the HCC to raise money for zoo projects, and it'll get your ex's name put on their roach board at the cockroach enclosure. You'll even get a certificate sent to you as a keepsake. Oh, and you can even name a cockroach after a friend's ex and send him or her the certificate.